Hello, I'm David Shackleton, and I'm going to be giving a presentation here on two works of African futurism: Wanuri Kahiu's 2009 film Pumzi and Nnedi Okorafor's 2015 novel The Book of Phoenix. This forms part of a panel on imagining environmental futures in the speculative eco-media stream. My overall contention is going to be that, as a subgenre of speculative fiction, African futurism provides environmental countervisions of the future that are urgently needed to counter climate capitalism, and the way in which actors from the global north continue to strategically underdevelop many African countries in a neo-colonial manner. To start with, though, I'd like to reflect on the term African futurism and situate it alongside the better known term Afrofuturism. So Afrofuturism as a cultural movement is most often associated with artists and writers from the US. We might think of writers like Octavia E. Butler or N.K. Jemisin, musicians like Sun Ra or Janelle Monáe, or filmmakers like Ryan Coogler with his 2018 movie Black Panther. There is a question then, which is one raised by Sophia Samatar, whether it is appropriate to use this term Afrofuturism as a descriptor of speculative fiction from the African continent. She goes on to argue that it is, writing, and I quote, "In the philosophy of the remix, the combination of folklore and science fiction is perfectly possible. In the poetics of myth-making, which draws on the past in order to imagine the future, it is necessary." I think that her way of thinking of African futurism as a remix or combination of folklore and science fiction is a particularly rich way of thinking about it, and I'll try and draw that out in relation to Kahiu and Okorafor. It's also a way of thinking that is used by both the artists that I'll be talking about today. Wanuri Kahiu says in a TED Talk on the subject that I wanted to find a place for Afrofuturism in Africa. As a storyteller in the tradition of the Kikuyu, my tradition is to be a seer, not just a historian, and to be able to say that there is more to life than we see and listen to storytellers. They also have a voice, and their voice is important. Nnedi Okorafor makes a similar point, although she uses the term African futurism rather than Afrofuturism, so this is where I've adopted the term from. She writes, "I am an African futurist. African futurism is similar to Afrofuturism in the way that blacks on the continent and in the black diaspora are all connected by blood, spirit, history and future. The difference is that African futurism is specifically and more directly rooted in African culture, history, mythology and point of view, as it then branches into the black diaspora, and it does not privilege or centre the West. African futurism is concerned with visions of the future, is interested in technology, leaves the earth, skews optimistic, is centred on and predominantly written by people of African descent, black people, and is rooted first and foremost in Africa." I just want to pick up on one aspect of her characterisation there, which is that African futurism skews optimistic. I think that optimism can be read against what the critic Kodwo Eshun writes in a very brilliant essay on Afrofuturism, when he talks about the way, the common way in which Africa exists as the object of futurist projection by multinationals and non-governmental organisations and other entities, and the way that these entities tend to portray African futures in a very negative light, and indeed that they turn Africa into what Eshun calls the zone of their absolute dystopia. The more positive or optimistic visions of African futurism counteract these sorts of portrayals. So to start with, I'd like to look at the first work, which is Kahiu's film Pumzi, and I'm going to start by showing a clip which is about 1.5 minutes from the very start of the film.
Dream detected. Take your dreams of presence. Dream detected. Take your dreams of presence.
So, as we can see from that opening clip, the film is set in a futuristic East African territory after a catastrophic water war. Asha, the main protagonist, works in a museum of natural history, and in those shots we get an indication of what has led to this situation. We have a newspaper article that tells us about climate change. It's called The Greenhouse Effect, and it's telling us how the Earth is changing already. And we have another newspaper article which is documenting a whole day journey in search of water, so flagging the sort of water shortages. And we also get an exhibit which shows the last tree, and indeed outside the compound we get these very parched and desolate landscapes. This futuristic scenario can be read in the context of the 2009 to 11 drought in Kenya and the structural adjustment programs imposed by the World Bank and the IMF since the 1980s. As part of these programs, these institutions seized on the risks posed by climate change, drought and famine to advance loans and impose free market reforms. The converse of their bleak environmental projections are the utopian futures, such as those imagined in the IMF's Kenya Vision 2030, that could supposedly be realised by taking on debt to stimulate development. Now, as part of these programmes, the World Bank and the IMF drew on a very familiar visual iconography of African women carrying water through sort of parched landscapes. And that was a sort of part of their programme of wanting to impose these structural adjustment programmes. Kahiu, I think, is very much picking up on this familiar imagery, but she's reworking and reconverting it from that more sort of pessimistic dystopian register to an optimistic one. Indeed, we see on the close-up that we have a picture of the Maitu, or mother seed, which we're told in Kikuyu language comes from Ma, meaning truth, and Itu, meaning ours, meaning our truth. Returning to Samatar's point about folklore, Kahiu is using this Kikuyu folklore in her futuristic story. And indeed, Asha goes on to take this mother seed. She breaks free of her compound, having had a kind of vision of potential regeneration, and ends up planting her the seed. And one nice detail as she goes is that she is carrying a compass with her, which she steals from the museum, but this stops working, so she ends up throwing it away. This is a way for Kahiu to signal to us as viewers that Asha, her protagonist, is leaving any sort of realistic cartographic space or coordinates, and she's entering a utopian space. Utopia, of course, meaning no place. And Asha goes on to plant her tree. By doing so, this is Kahiu's also drawing on specifically on Wangari Maathai's Greenbelt movement, and Kahiu filmed a documentary about Maathai and about her how she kind of developed this program. The Mũgumo tree, which is the one that you can see Maathai holding there, is a kind of symbolic one. Again, it's drawn from Kikuyu culture. It becomes a sort of symbol of resistance both against British colonialism in Kenya and then later against the Kenyan government's development of the country. And I suppose we can finish up by saying that Kahiu is redeploying this symbol and this image in her fictional kind of future. It's a counter image of development. Next, in this whistle-stop tour, go on to think about Okorafor's The Book of Phoenix as a work of petrofiction. I'll start by reading out a short extract, which in context is, this is an account spoken by character Muo, who is talking to Phoenix, who's the heroine of the novel. He's talking about how he joined a radical student organisation in his youth called Wazobia, who resisted the Nigerian government, and particularly the fossil fuel companies that were operating in the country. He tells us about the Anansi droids 419 and writes that the Anansi droids were, how do I explain them? They were digital android killer soldiers. They were the size of dogs and looked like shiny silver spiders. And he goes on to tell us that Chevron, Shell and a few other oil companies helped fund the project. The purpose of these machines was to prevent pipeline bunkering by guarding them by any means necessary. Though the machines were supposedly artificially intelligent, they killed senselessly. If you so much as touched a pipeline, they came running and tore you apart. These pipelines ran right through the backyards of villages. They ran alongside roads past schools. Within the first month, hundreds of people were killed. This science fictional conceit of the futuristic Anansi droids can be read in the context of the future scenarios that were used by Royal Dutch Shell at the time that they were extracting oil from the Niger Delta in Nigeria. Now, these future scenarios presented, they're called the Tina scenarios, they presented the ways that the world could develop, and the only two alternatives that Shell provided were worlds in which multinational corporations continued to harmoniously extract fossil fuels in a free market economy. There are slight differences between those two variants, but both of them are portrayed in a very kind of positive light. In some sense, these future scenarios, which are a tool for kind of corporations, governments, and other organisations to think what might happen in the future and to adapt to them, in some sense, they kind of resemble the Book of Phoenix, in that both of them are imagining futures for Nigeria and for Africa. And perhaps there's no sort of surprise there if we reflect on the fact that the RAND Corporation, who helped kind of develop these as a technique for imagining the future, employed science fiction writers like Arthur C. Clarke and Isaac Asimov to kind of create this as a tool. However, there are very clear differences in the Book of Phoenix. Instead of the harmonious extraction of fossil fuels, we have this very violent process that benefits nobody other than a few members of the government and the multinational corporations. Of course, this reflects the real history in the Niger Delta. The Shell had presented this as an excellent development opportunity for people in the area, although in practice this was not the case. The Ogoni people in particular suffered from gas flaring and the environmental devastation of the Niger Delta, which took away many of their livelihoods. Famously, Ken Saro-Wiwa, who was a prominent environmental activist, was killed for his resistance to Shell and the Nigerian government. Okorafor, I think, is channeling this history of resistance, these counter visions of development, and is drawing on that on a portrayal of characters like Muo and also of Phoenix in the Book of Phoenix. So to conclude, I hope to have suggested some of the ways in which African futurism as a subgenre of speculative fiction provides counter-visions to the development, the mainstream development paths for African countries. They're ways of drawing attention to the ways that these often involve environmental and social devastation, and they foreground alternatives to such development. Thank you.